Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Today is the first day of fall, and the weather here in Jackson is glorious. If your mind, like mine, turns to outdoor projects this time of year, I commend to your attention our upcoming gardening workshop on heirloom camellias. The program will take place at the Eudora Welty House and Garden on Thursday, October 7th at 4 p.m. You can register on the department's website. And then tune in next week for History's Lunch, when we'll be joined from North Carolina by Betty Dixon, the author of Leaving Mississippi. Today, we are delighted to have our first international History's Lunch program with historian Emma Folwell from Birmingham, England, to discuss her new University Press of Mississippi book, The War on Poverty in Mississippi, From Massive Resistance to New Conservatism. Fulbright Award winner Emma J. Folwell is senior lecturer at Newman University in Birmingham, England, or the other Birmingham, as it is known in Mississippi. She earned her BA and PhD degrees in history from the University of Leicester and her MST in American history from the Queen's College, Oxford. Folwell's research has been supported by grants from the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library, the British Association for American Studies, and the Royal Historical Society. She's been published in the Journal of Mississippi History, Journal of American Studies, and Reviews in History. We had planned to have Emma join us live for her program, but we wound up needing to have her record her presentation yesterday afternoon. That means we won't be able to have a question and answer period today. Now, here's Emma Folwell.
Thank you for the opportunity of coming to talk with you about the war on poverty in Mississippi in the 1960s and 1970s. It's really great to be here, even virtually, and I hope everyone is keeping as safe and well as possible in really difficult circumstances. I want to start out by giving you an idea of where the research project came from, where the book sort of fits. And so I'm going to start with where I sort of started exploring ideas about the civil rights movement, and that was with a traditional narrative, a so-called short movement that focused on legal rights. The story goes, it began in 1954 with the Supreme Court's ruling in the case of Brown versus Board. And although the decision did not fully desegregate public education, it put the Supreme Court on the side of racial equality. It was the springboard for the decade of activism that followed. The iconic activists of this era, from Medgar Evers to Fannie Lou Hamer and thousands of others besides, captivated me as a student as I studied stories of Mississippi's local people. This was the civil rights movement as I had understood it from popular memory, this short movement from the traditional narrative. A movement that began in the mid-50s that culminated in the mid-1960s with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. With the passage of these acts, so goes the traditional narrative. The civil rights movement had succeeded. The violence that came after 1965, the riots of the late 60s, the emergence of Black power, Black nationalism, that was all divorced from an earlier respectable non-violent movement. Now, this short civil rights movement narrative is problematic in a number of ways. It creates a series of false dichotomies, respectable Southern non-violent movement taking place before 65, and then the violent, the post-65, the Northern struggle. The short movement idea seeks to undermine the legitimacy of Black activism, other than that was during the authorized non-violent period, which has become sort of sanitized in public memory. The short movement idea ignores the long years of activism on which this indisputably significant decade in the 50s and 60s was built. And it also ignores the continuities evident in the post-1965 struggles, most significantly, the centrality of economic justice to the Black freedom struggle. In the last 20 years or so, historians have begun to undermine this traditional narrative and to unpick many of the events. Most significantly, considerable work has been done to illustrate the problems with this short movement and develop a long movement framework. For example, if we go back to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in the case of Brown versus Board, that according to the traditional narrative started it all, the work of Patricia Sullivan in her 2009 study of the NAACP called Lift Every Voice has shown that Brown, far from being the beginning of the movement, was the culmination of years of hard-fought legal battles for the NAACP's Legal Defence Fund. Brown was the result of those years of struggle and the development of tactics and evidence and support. And then Glenda Gilmore's work from 2008, Defying Dixie, places the origins or traces the civil rights activism back to the 1920s, overturning, and I quote, the simplified story broadcast across the nation in black and white television from the 1950s. Perhaps even more work has been done to extend the end date of the short movement. Recent works that extend the end date of this traditional movement beyond 1965 have done so by exploring the relationship between the civil rights movement, civil rights activists, and the war on poverty. Susan Ashmore's work, you can see there, on Alabama's war on poverty, William Clayson on Texas, Ludus and Korstad in North Carolina, and many others have shown that civil rights activism continued in so many guises in the South after 1965. And they undermine many of the false dichotomies of that short movement framework. For example, post-1965 civil rights activism through the framework of the war on poverty happened in the North as well as the Deep South. And these works also undermine the divisions between Black power activists and the traditional narrative's non-violent activists. They illustrate that both are pursuing that same goal of economic opportunity through different means. A second facet of my research has come from the exploration of the white response to the war on poverty, or I should say massive resistors' responses to the war on poverty. Again, it builds on recent developments in the scholarship that have deepened our understanding of massive resistance in the Deep South, particularly in Mississippi. Like the civil rights movements, the idea of massive resistance has developed a traditional narrative around it that's quite narrow in scope and duration. In this traditional narrative, massive resistance encompassed a sort of brief backlash to Brown, embodied in the Southern Manifesto, that resolution signed by 19 senators and 77 members of the House of Representatives in 1956, which condemned the Brown ruling, and perhaps in the closure of the public schools in Virginia in 1958. Now, it's this limited understanding of massive resistance that my research has sort of sought to overturn and think again about. Massive resistance was, I think, too broad, complex, too multifaceted to have been limited to a decade-long political backlash against the Supreme Court's Brown ruling. And there is a developing historiography, developing scholarship that explores what Jason Morgan Ward has termed the long massive resistance. While Ward explores the decades before the 1950s, Joe Crispino's work looks at the years after 1965 and what he terms the conservative counter-revolution. And it's here in these sort of scholarly developments that my work sits, drawing on the framework of the long civil rights movement and its relationship with the war on poverty, and of the long frameworks of massive resistance. Before I go too much further, I just want to briefly contextualize Mississippi's war on poverty. So bear with me for a couple of minutes if you are already familiar with the war on poverty. In his 1964 State of the Union address, President Lyndon Johnson declared an unconditional war against poverty. His war on poverty would, I quote, eliminate the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty in this nation by opening to everyone the opportunity for education and training, the opportunity to work, and the opportunity to live in decency and dignity. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 provided $947 million of funding for a range of programs, including job training, youth employment, adult education programs, community action programs, legal services, VISTA, the Volunteers in Service to America. The Act also created a new agency, the Office of Economic Opportunity, more often termed OEO, to coordinate all of these anti-poverty efforts at the federal level. Now, the war on poverty was created at an historic moment. It was the high watermark of liberalism. It was founded in the belief that it was the right and the responsibility of the federal government to address the seemingly newly discovered poverty in America. And one of the most powerful, interesting, controversial parts of the war on poverty were community action programs. These programs called for the maximum feasible participation of the poor. Three fairly innocuous words, but the potential for this was pretty incredible. The idea was that local communities would band together and decide what they needed. Do they need a Head Start program for preschool children, or do they need a community centre or help for the elderly? The possibilities seemed like they were endless. And once accepted, the federal government, through the OEO, the Office for Economic Opportunity, would fund these programs directly, with anything from about $10,000 up to millions of dollars in some cases. If we could turn back to Mississippi, in the early 1960s, war on poverty funds were definitely needed in Mississippi. The state was home to some of the poorest people in the country, often living in isolated rural communities. In 1960, the state's poverty rate was over twice the national average, with 55% of the state living beneath the poverty threshold, compared with 22% of the national population. Black Mississippians suffered in particular overwhelmingly from the combination of the bleak economic conditions and discrimination. Almost 80% of Black Mississippians were poor in the early 1960s. But it wasn't just money that came with war on poverty and the war on poverty's community action programs in particular. The community action concept, was almost revolutionary, particularly in the Deep South. This was because the federal funding for community action programs bypassed state control, meaning it also bypassed the mechanisms of white power. Mississippi's first and largest community action program was a Head Start program. That's where the template came from, called the Child Development Group of Mississippi. And it was an incredible showcase of just what these federal funds could do when they bypassed state control. Funds went directly to the Child Development Group, which was created and run by Black activists, veterans of Freedom Summer, and in some cases, it built on decades of civil rights activism. The program grew across the state in 1965 and 66, operating classes on an integrated basis. Now, the education of young children in Head Start classes, in integrated Head Start classes, was seen by some Mississippians as a direct threat to their way of life. The war on poverty, the funds, the potential it brought with it, arrived in Mississippi in 1965 into what University of Mississippi history professor James W. Silver had described just a year earlier as a closed society. In small communities across the state in the mid to the late 1960s, war on poverty programs often met with a fairly ferocious response. The federally funded war on poverty The embodiment of 60s liberalism clashed explosively with Mississippi's closed society. The result, one Mississippian recalled, was, and I quote, like all hell broke loose. From 1965 to 1973, there was both a war against poverty in Mississippi and a war against the war on poverty. The war on poverty itself provided a powerful tool for Black empowerment, drawing on the vitality of Mississippi's civil rights movement. At the same time, the fight against the war on poverty served as a template for massive resistance and entrenchment, a way to undermine liberalism, marginalize Black political power, and as a way to articulate a new conservatism. The resistance of some massive resistors, white Mississippians, to social change, through their evolving resistance to the war on poverty, lay at the heart of an emerging new conservatism in the state. And what my book does is to trace both the war on poverty and the war against the war on poverty. It looks at the attempts of white and Black Mississippians to use anti-poverty programs to address the desperate poverty in the state. And the need for such programs was obviously great, but they were about more than simply assisting poor people. The two forces, the war on poverty and the fight against it, transformed Mississippi. At times, poverty programs became an incredibly powerful, innovative tool for Black empowerment. At the same time, some anti-poverty programs became potent mechanisms of some white resistance to Black advancement. And through the war on poverty, both Black activism and white opposition evolved. Some opponents of racial change used massive resistance as a template to resist Black economic empowerment through the war on poverty. And in doing so, they forged anti-poverty programs into tools that subverted the Great Society agenda and marginalized Black political power. And I'm going to do my best in the next few minutes to try and outline some instances of the war on poverty and the war against the war on poverty. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the first and the most high-profile anti-poverty battle in Mississippi, and that was around the Child Development Group. Then I'm going to spend some time thinking about the consequences of this fight, specifically how some Mississippians responded to their failure to destroy the Child Development Group. And in the wake of that failure, a raft of new anti-poverty programs were created in an attempt to cement white control over the scope and the nature of the war on poverty. And then finally, I'm going to turn to the political front in the battle against the war on poverty and look briefly at the response of the state's small, growing Republican Party. So first then, the Child Development Group. It's the most familiar story of Mississippi's war on poverty. It was, as I said, one of the earliest and most high-profile programs of the war on poverty, not just in the state, but across the nation. It was first funded in the summer of 1965. And it combined those federal funds from OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, with the grassroots activism of Mississippi's Freedom Summer. The threat of federally funded civil rights activism, or what seemed like federally funded civil rights activism, brought an immediate response from massive resistors in the state. They launched a campaign waged from the grassroots to the state's political elite. The campaign drew on the tactics of the previous decade of massive resistance. There was a combination from a variety of sources, including violence, threats, harassment, intimidation, accusations of communist infiltration, of outside agitators causing racial unrest, and the wielding of political power in Washington too by Senator John Stennis. This massive resistance campaign against the Child Development Group, and you can see some examples of it on the screen here. One cartoon with Reds in Cuba telling an activist to go out and spread the word, and he's sponsored by the OEO. And you can see the other cartoon there called Poverty Hanky Panky, in which federal funding is going straight to lefties. This campaign meant serious cuts in funding for the Child Development Group. The group only just really survived the barrage of complaints and attacks against it. But crucially, the Child Development Group did survive. Nevertheless, the opposition from massive resistors meant the group had decreased levels of funding, a lot of centres were closed, there were a lot of staff cuts, and ultimately, a lot less preschool children were able to benefit from their classes. It was a traumatic and turbulent few months for the staff and for the children too. As Crystal Sanders has described in her book, Chance for Change, the group's survival is a testament to the courage and the determination of the poverty warriors, of their sheer hard work in running the organisation, from the few sort of outsiders to the hundreds of Mississippi staff. There are, though, important and too often overlooked consequences to this battle against the Child Development Group, and crucially, the consequences of its survival. The survival of the group was a transformative moment. The failure of the white establishment to destroy the Child Development Group marked the end of the traditional phase of massive resistance, which began with opposition to the Brown ruling in 1954. For a decade, massive resistance was a dominant force comprising powerful social, economic, and political facets. It didn't end in 1964 with the passage of Civil Rights Act. Seeing the passage of this legislation as the end of massive resistance ignores the central facet of massive resistance, that it opposes federal intervention in state affairs. But massive resistance was declining by the time the Child Development Group arrived in Mississippi in 1965. And the failure of the campaign against the Child Development Group marked one of the last such big battles in Mississippi. And after that, resistance continued, but crucially, it continued in new forms. One of the consequences of the failure of this massive resistance campaign against the Child Development Group was a mobilization by the state structures to attempt to use the war on poverty, attempt to capture those war on poverty funds. Senator Stennis and Governor Paul B. Johnson provided the clarion call for some Mississippians. They used ostensibly race-neutral calls for, and I quote, local responsible people to create their own community action agencies. Their calls were a little more than a thinly veiled request for those seeking to slow the pace of racial change to enact a defensive localism. This defensive localism was designed to enable the white power structure to re-establish its control over Black advancement. And the result was a mobilization, a scramble, if you like, for OEO funds for community action programs. It's actually facilitated by the Office for Economic Opportunity itself. The OEO director and President Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, himself approved the funding of a host of state-approved community action programs in order to appease Mississippi's powerful politicians in the wake of what became seen as a sort of debacle over the Child Development Group. Now, the call by some Mississippi leaders for local responsible people to create their own anti-poverty programs or to join the boards of already existing ones transformed Mississippi's war on poverty. The state's anti-poverty programs were, after 1966, no longer the reserve of civil rights activists who wanted to harness the power of the federal government to secure Black economic opportunity. There will be now many white Mississippians sitting on the board of anti-poverty programs alongside Black Mississippians. Now, this was one of the achievements, one of the remarkable things about the war on poverty. The acceptance of integration, the integrated nature of so many of these programs was remarkable in the context of the state's slow move towards integrated schools. But this acceptance of integrated anti-poverty programs masked a determination of the white power structures of the state to retain their power and control. Now, this was a big deal. Poverty was literally big business in Mississippi. By 1967, the state had received over $40 million in OEO funds. And many Mississippians were determined that these funds and the economic, the political power that went with them would not fall solely into the hands of Black activists. Governor Paul Johnson moved quickly to do whatever he could to support the local responsible people he called for by creating a state infrastructure for the war on poverty, including a state office of economic opportunity. I'm quoting NAACP leader Benny Goodin here, and he said, they went around and told people, boards of supervisors and city governments, that if they didn't hurry up and get an organization going, the Blacks were going to get the money and they were going to run it, end quote. Now, the structure of the war on poverty actually facilitated the actions of these local responsible people. The community-centered nature of anti-poverty programs, I've described that idea of maximum feasible participation, meant that the Office for Economic Opportunity in Washington often failed to gauge whether programs were truly representing poor communities. And then to contend with, the Office for Economic Opportunity itself had many administrative shortcomings, both in Washington and its regional office in Atlanta. And that often made the situation much worse. It made everything more complicated. Now, I've described some of the responses to the war on poverty in the aftermath of the Child Development Group so far, but there are so many different, really, wars against poverty going on in Mississippi, so many different people involved for so many different reasons, it is impossible to capture them all. And that's in part due to the inherently community-based local nature of the funding and the programs themselves. Mississippians' responses to anti-poverty programs were immensely varied, and of course they changed over time. Among Mississippi's Catholic community, activists including Marge Baroni and Father Nathaniel Macheski are but two examples of Mississippians who embraced the war on poverty and used it as a means to continue their work to improve society and address racial inequality. There are other fascinating stories of the Catholic Church's involvement in the war on poverty. They ran, the Diocese of Jackson, Natchez ran one of the biggest war on poverty programs in the state called STAR, the Strategic Training and Redevelopment Job Training Program. And there are some fascinating times I spent in the archives at the Diocese in Jackson there with some incredibly detailed documents that cover this vast program run by the Catholic Church across the state. But back to the extraordinary sort of range of people involved in the war on poverty. There are also a great many white moderates involved with anti-poverty efforts. Now I'm using the term moderate to mean people who were perhaps unhappy with integration or the pace of racial change, but probably saw it as unavoidable. Once the initial backlash to the Child Development Group faded, both white supporters and white moderates played an important role in shaping the state's war on poverty. Increasingly in concert with Black Mississippians, most often NAACP leaders rather than SNCC or core activists. Together, alliances shifted the landscape of the war on poverty in the wake of the Child Development Group. White and Black moderates, for example, forged a new statewide Head Start program, Mississippi Action for Progress. Now, the new program was deemed acceptable by the state's white power structure because while its board of directors was integrated and its director was a Black woman, Helen Bass Williams, it acceded to pressure to eschew this sort of radicalism and Black participation that had characterized the Child Development Group. Operating within white segregationist power structures, some anti-poverty programs became mechanisms of state power within the new integrated reality. However, these integrated alliances were not the only forces shaping the war on poverty. White supremacists took particular exception to the war on poverty, and they targeted anti-poverty centres with burning crosses, with bullets. Among the most violent of the white extremists was, of course, the KKK. Now, the state was home to a number of Klan groups in the 1960s, the United Klans of America, the White Knights, the Original Knights. While rhetorically sort of united united as white Christians in their own terminology against common enemies, whether they be Black or Jewish people, the federal government, what they termed white race traitors. These groups were in competition with each other for members. They disagreed also over their targets, over tactics, but nonetheless, they all responded to the war on poverty with a mixture of, sort of vitriol and violence. They targeted poverty warriors of both races. The Child Development Group was a frequent target, and its integrated successor, Mississippi Action for Progress, was also targeted with its white staff labelled in Klan hate sheets as, and I'm quoting, traitors of the white race and stooges of a federal government conspiracy to create, and I'm quoting again, a socialist Black republic in the South. It was an interesting insight into the vitriolic rhetoric of the Klan. It's not an organisation that keeps a lot of records. There are some fascinating holdings in the archives in the University of Mississippi, though, detailing the opposition against to the war on poverty, particularly to white poverty warriors involved in integrated programs at this point. And what you can see on the slide here is the places in which anti-poverty activists reported to OEO or to their own programs that they faced burning crosses, bullets through the windows, and other sorts of violence attacks, either on their centres or against the anti-poverty workers themselves between about 1965 and 1968. But it wasn't just Klan violence, it wasn't that was fighting against the war on poverty. There was another front in the battle, the political front. Now, the state Republican Party were quick to respond to Senator Stennis's failure to destroy the Child Development Group. He was really involved in attempts in Washington to get the funds for the Child Development Group cut off, but was unable to achieve his goals completely. And Republicans wanted to capitalize on this failure, and they did so in a number of ways. So state Republicans encouraged local politicians to take advantage of the sort of patronage opportunities offered by anti-poverty programs. They sought to woo new supporters of the Republican Party by publicly opposing the refunding of former Child Development Group centres, so those that had been closed down and that were attempting to get funding for just smaller sort of offshoots of the Child Development Group. At the grassroots too, Republican Party members were articulating a new conservatism that was predicated on ostensibly race-neutral language, a language of rights and responsibilities. With little urbanization at this point and little suburbanization, Republicanism in Mississippi developed differently from many Sunbelt states. The Republicans articulated a conservative colorblindness that was not the invention of white suburbanites, but it was a language that had always been part of segregationist politics in the Deep South. Now, at that time, Republicanism in Mississippi drew less on a shared environment, a Sunbelt or a suburb, than it did on a basic conservative, cultural, racial, and religious foundation. And there was a level of ideological cohesion between the segregationist Democratic politicians and the Republicans in the 1960s. And it was greater in Mississippi than in any other state, as the sort of overtly racialized features of the old Mississippi politics were absorbed into a broader sort of economic and social conservatism. The response of Mississippians to anti-poverty programs, those sort of massive resistors, exposes the divide between the national liberal and Southern conservative Democrats that broke down the solid South. The development of Mississippi's Republican Party was not the result of their inherent grassroots strength, certainly didn't derive from their ability to ride on the coattails of Republican presidential candidates at this point in the late 60s. Rather, the hard work of grassroots conservatives enabled Republicans to harness mass resentments and provide a home for what Michael Katzin has termed the white refugees from the liberal crack-up. Now, these grassroots conservatives, combined with the evolving massive resistance, with ostensibly race-neutral articulations of opposition to anti-poverty programs. It's really fascinating to explore the work of many of these grassroots groups operating in the late 1960s, the early 1970s. They were significant contributors to the burgeoning base of support for Republicans, particularly Republican women's groups. They were at times instrumental in forging a sort of race-neutral opposition to the war on poverty. And in doing so, they were attempting to establish Republicans as the true conservative party. In Forest County in 1966, for example, the local chapter of the Federation of Republican Women held a potluck party featuring true conservative speaker James Moy, speaking about LBJ and the war on poverty, the Great Society. And you can see here part of the sort of ironic flyer advertising the event. They're inviting poor, pulverized patriots to help fight the war on poverty by voting Republican, defeating LBJ. They utilized language that contained no reference to race, but which couched anti-poverty programs as un-American, as against God, against freedom and independence. This type of rhetoric was essential to the slow but steady growth of the state Republican Party. By linking conservatism to patriotism, to religion, Republicans at the grassroots were attempting to undermine Mississippi Democrats by making it look like the Democrats were in collusion with the liberalism of LBJ's Great Society and war on poverty. So Mississippi Republicans had a really complex role actually to play in responses to the war on poverty. In part, they were sort of attacking the premise of anti-poverty programs. And in part, they also wanted to exploit the potential patronage opportunities they offered. Remember, this is a lot of money sort of flowing into the state via these programs. And if you were on the board of one of these programs, you were going to have a say on how some of that money was spent. Most important to the development of the Republican Party, however, was the chance to articulate a distinctive brand of Southern conservatism and thus undercut the state Democratic Party. Now, once Richard Nixon came into office in '69, opportunities to undermine the Democrats became even more frequent. Now, Nixon himself failed to boost or even really support Mississippi Republicans' electoral prospects. And state Republicans weren't particularly happy with Nixon and his failure to completely abolish the war on poverty and the Office for Economic Opportunity immediately on taking office. Nonetheless, Nixon's electoral success provided the state party with an opportunity to use its new connections with the new Republican administration, connections they could use to undermine anti-poverty programs they didn't like and thus enhance their credibility among state Republicans. Although the number and the influence of Republican politicians in the state remained low at this point, Republican politicians and party members were not slow in alerting their party to potential corruption or ineptitude in the Office for Economic Opportunity. State Republican Party Chairman Clark Reed developed a relationship with OEO Director Don Rumsfeld, who Nixon appointed, and you can see them here, and with Carrie Hall, who was the Southeast Regional Director of Department of Health, Education and Welfare. Reed and the Republican Party's Executive Secretary W.T. Wilkins used their connections with Hall, with Rumsfeld, to assist Republican mayors and politicians and supporters to extend control of the programs they preferred and to seek to defund centres, mostly those that had previously been part of the Child Development Group. In Yazoo City, for example, Republican Mayor Jeffrey Barber, one of only 4 Republican mayors in the state in 1969, he was on the board of a local anti-poverty program, Yazoo Community Action. Now, the program had already been subject to investigation by OEO for its discriminatory activities. Barber exploited Clark Reed's connection to Don Rumsfeld and his assistant Dick Cheney to secure OEO support for Yazoo Community Action, the sort of segregationist leaning community action program. Over in Sunflower County, Wilkins was involved in attempts to undermine a small anti-poverty program. It was a Head Start program called Associated Communities of Sunflower County. It was run in part by activist Fannie Lou Hamer. Of course, you can see here back in 1964. At the time, the program had been part of the Child Development Group, but was an offshoot of that program. And activists running Head Start in Sunflower County were attempting to get it independently funded after the cutting of the Child Development Group's grants. But there was an establishment-approved program there, Sunflower County Progress, that was also applying to OEO for funding. And the Republican Wilkins involvement was helpful in ensuring that Hamer's program didn't get an independent grant and was actually placed under the control of the sort of state-approved anti-poverty program. So in both of these Delta counties, Sunflower and Yazoo, the role of the Mississippi Republican Party proved decisive in re-establishing sort of state control over what had been burgeoning economic advancements. And it was a pattern that was repeated in communities across the state, establishing white control, which undermined Black involvement in anti-poverty programs and proved politically beneficial for the nascent state Republican Party. Now, I had not really ever intended to go into the 1970s with my research and looking at Nixon's actions in the war on poverty and the way it shaped the war on poverty in Mississippi was sort of almost an add-on that came a little bit later, but it led to really fascinating research, not only in Atlanta, but also at Nixon's presidential library in California and later in Reagan's as well over there. But it shed new light on some of these connections and the relationship between Nixon's rapidly waning support for the war on poverty, not that he had much to start with, and the way that the war on poverty unfolded in Mississippi in the early 1970s. So in the battles over the war on poverty, the poor were the losers, ultimately. Racial discrimination served as a tool to exclude poor Black Mississippians, and it worsened the omnipresent administrative problems in many anti-poverty programs and the Office for Economic Opportunity itself. Discrimination undermined the work of dedicated anti-poverty warriors of both races, who did not want their anti-poverty programs to be used to entrench discrimination against the state's poor population. But the massive resistance to Black economic empowerment through the war on poverty relied on more than racial discrimination. The war against the war on poverty became a crucible in which racial hostility was forged into a powerful new conservatism. Now, this resistance did not take the form of doomed last stands or vitriolic racist rhetoric of the earlier massive resistance. Rather, it was an evolving opposition that adapted to racial change. It drew on the tactics of the sort of classic phase of massive resistance between 54 and 65, and it combined it with a new language of opposition that used the sort of grassroots legacy of Goldwater conservatism. These massive resistors, operating from the grassroots to the political elite, adopted new methods and mechanisms of resistance. Foremost amongst these was the acceptance of integration in anti-poverty programs. With this acceptance came the opportunity to regain control and direct the pace of racial change. Now, it was a calculated maneuver, and one which was by no means guaranteed to be successful. But over the years of the war on poverty, massive resistors did, in places, succeed in forging many anti-poverty programs into mechanisms of control. Through these programs, white Mississippi regained control of the pace and the nature of Black advancement. Perhaps even more significantly, the anti-poverty programs divided local Black communities and undermined in places the development of Black leadership. While poverty rates did decline in Mississippi over the course of the 1960s, there's absolutely no denying that. The fight against the state's war on poverty ensured that community activism, that idea of maximum feasible participation, was stifled. And every turn, activists striving to achieve Black economic and political power were halted. Racial discrimination pervaded Mississippi's anti-poverty programs, operating as they were in this structure of a sort of still segregationist state power. And this crippled the operation of the majority of its community action programs. There were changes evident in attitudes over the years of the war on poverty, of course, as resistance to Black advancement evolved. And there were increasing numbers of integrated anti-poverty programs. But these accommodations to racial change were limited, and their impact was undermined by the many and varied ways in which massive resistance to Black economic and political opportunity adapted to the new conditions. Through their opposition to the war on poverty, massive resistors forged powerful linkages between the racially based conservative opposition to social welfare from the New Deal to the rise of the New Right. These linkages were forged most visibly in Mississippi and Mississippi's war on poverty, but the patterns of white opposition to war on poverty are evident outside the state too. Opponents of the war on poverty drew on conservative ideology which opposed federal taxation and social welfare programs in race-neutral terms. And it was the combination of conservative rhetoric opposing the wastage of taxpayers' money with the massive resistance tactics that evoked fears of radicalism and outside agitators that formed an incredibly powerful opposition to the war on poverty. Thank you for your time. I hope you found this interesting.
We're grateful. We're grateful to Emma Folwell for the presentation to get today, and not only for the presentation, but for going the extra mile to make it happen. A reminder for viewers who came in late, we had to pre-record that yesterday, so we won't be able to take questions from the audience or comments. But for those of you who would like to know more, the book is The War on Poverty in Mississippi, published by the University Press of Mississippi. It's available at better bookstores across the state. Tune in for History is Lunch next week when we'll have Betty Dixon, the author of Leaving Mississippi. And until then, thank you all for watching the program today.